In this video, I'm going to do a review of the Kreg Benchtop Router Table. Right now, this router table as a package comes in at about $250. It's not too far off of what I paid maybe a year and a half ago. So, relatively same cost over time. And there's good reason for that. And we'll go into the pros and cons and break down each part of this. But if you don't care about any of that and just want to know whether you should buy this, it's a 100% yes for me. There are a few things that I don't love, but on the whole, this is one of the best value tools I've bought. The amount of things that you can do when you have access to a router table to allow you to use your hands free, it's stunning. So absolutely a buy for me, and we'll now go into the rest of the review. Alright, so let's just go over what's included here. You get this table, which is about 24 by 16. So a pretty decent size, not the same as Kreg's larger router table. It's not a full-size router table, it's a benchtop. So you get the table has a miter slot, you get this movable fence, which also has a miter slot, or a T-track slot rather here. This is a normal miter slot, this is a T-track slot. You get the plate, the insert plate that you connect your router base to, as well as 3 reducer rings to allow for different sizes of router bits while also making sure that you have as minimal area exposed so that you don't tip down into the bit at all. You also get this to remove and insert the rings. You do not, however, get this switch in front. This is extra. I believe it was about $32, $33 from Kreg, and it's great. I'm sure there are plenty of other aftermarket ones, but I'm extremely happy that I bought that. I think it adds a safety functionality and just an overall ease of use, because without that you have to reach under to turn your router on, or more importantly off. And if you're in the middle of some kind of sketchy cut and you need to turn it off when you have the piece and you have to hold it down, it's easy to hit this with your knee, your thigh, whatever. So definitely consider this when you buy this table. Also included in this table are 4 leveling, I guess we'll call them inserts, which we will go over more detail here when we go over the plate, as well as an Allen wrench to adjust those. So this has a mechanism to do the leveling and the adjustment yourself. You're not totally relying on the table being perfect when you get it from the factory. So we're going to go over each of the components of this in no particular order. We're going to start with the fence. This is aluminum extrusion on the back and these MDF coated face panel fronts. And the way this fence works is essentially 2 keyhole slots that are in the table itself. We've got these 2 locking mechanisms on the back, which will pull the bottom up and will cause the fence to be pulled towards the table, or vice versa. So it's actually a pretty good locking system. One thing I want to note, if you're struggling to get the fence in there, you've just bought this for whatever reason, you need to have these turned towards, if you're facing from the back, your right. And they also have screws in there when you assemble them. That determines how tight it pulls to the table when you lock it. Now I have mine pretty tight. This moves nowhere when it's pretty tight, so you can adjust that as needed, and perhaps when you assemble everything you've done it too tight to start. So if you're struggling to get the table to slide through these keyhole slots, which can be a bit of a finicky procedure when you take the fence on and off, just remember these have to be turned towards your right if you're facing the back of this, and they may be too tight. While we're back here, we'll talk about the dust collection. This is a 2 1/4 inch interior, about 2 3/8 exterior. I have the rigid shop vac. It fits perfectly inside of this. I imagine most shop vacs that have that similar hose size will fit, and if need be, you can get reducers or expanders. This does a pretty good job of collecting dust. However, there are some lacking natures to the dust collection, and that lacking nature stems from how this fence moves. The plates on the front, these 2 plates right here, are adjustable. You lock them and unlock them using these 2 back knobs, and it allows it to slide, which is really cool because it allows you to use a larger size router bit to start. It's meant to avoid hitting the router bit. It also gives you a little extra fence length on the entry and exit, And it also kind of allows you to set up a stop block even further than the T-track if need be. There's also a T-track on the stop. If you buy, I believe Kreg sells their own flip stop for their miter gauge, which I believe would work just fine here, or any homemade one using T-bolts. So there's a real nice kind of added feature of this being able to remove, which I think is pretty common on most router tables. But because these are removable, you can make your own if something goes wrong. I actually had one of them that was not perfectly flat when I got it, so my piece of wood was hitting it, and Kreg sent me a replacement, totally free of charge. Great customer service. And in general, I really like this fence. When you tighten it correctly, it's very rigid. One of the things that is a bit tricky is that when you do the leveling plate, depending upon the leveling, and we'll go into this next, that can, with this phenolic insert plate, be pushed down if you have a lot of tension on this fence. So you have to find this middle ground between tightening this enough so that it doesn't move when you're applying pressure, and also not flattening down this leveling plate. It's a bit of a quirkiness to it, and it's because this is kind of a phenolic plastic instead of a metal. I have the router lift, and it doesn't have that problem because it's aluminum or whatever sort of metal it's made out of. Now, touching on this dust collection system again, and this is something with the router table as a whole, you only have dust collection for dust that can fly back. This will not collect any dust really from something like a groove. Anything where the router bit is under the wood, all the dust will naturally go down. If you have a box joint jig, you'll know that dust goes down. And it's the same way for this. So, if you're putting edge profiles or doing anything where this is open and the bit is exposed into there, it collects dust really well. But there is no inherent dust collection system for when you are running pieces of wood that are blocking this off. Another interesting quirk of this dust collection system is that if you have a decent sized shop vac and you've got it open and you're running something across, it will pull it in, and it will almost feel like at points it's getting harder to push, and it's because the suction, the more narrow you have this open, is actually quite strong through there. I like it. It helps me keep the piece against the fence. It does some of the work for you. But if you feel like you're having to push hard at some point, there's a chance that your vacuum is quite literally sucking the piece up to the fence. Included with the fence are these two plastic black rods. And what these are for is to turn the router table into a jointer, an edge jointer. And I'll show you up close here in a sec how these work. But these come with it and are actually really handy and really functional, and they sit in a slot on the back here. So if you're not seeing these in the box, there's a good chance they're pre-slid into this thing right here. So don't think you're missing these. They're probably just sitting in your fence. And what these rods do is they allow you to loosen up the faceplate and insert one into either of these holes. There are two sets, one top, one bottom, and you place them in the outfeed side, and they essentially jut out this face over here, which allows you to offset the router bit and use this as a jointer. A jointer, usually you're pushing flat against the table. The outfeed is slightly higher so that it matches the cutting amount that you're taking off. Like I said, I have a full video for that goes over that, but that's a nice little feature of the fence, is that you can turn it into an edge jointer. And it works pretty well, to be honest, really well. If you do everything correctly. It takes a little bit of setup time. It's a bit finicky, a lot of minor adjustments back and forth, but once you get it set, it works really well. Now, obviously, you have to remember when you're done to take these out of there, or else the next thing you run up against it will bump into the fence plate. One little nifty feature of having the T-slot right here is you can create stop blocks, essentially, to, I use them for if I'm cutting a groove that I don't want to go through, so a stop groove, I'll set a stop block on either side. I push the wood down onto it, slide it, and then I've got my stops automatically set. You just need a T-bolt, and it slides right into this here. You have to cut your own MDF, obviously, but it's an incredibly nice feature to have the ability to set a stop length and hit it, and you know you're good. You don't have to do any guesswork as to when to stop. All right, the next thing we're going to go over is the face insert, the plate insert, and then the leveling corner blocks. I'm not sure what Kreg calls them specifically. So it comes with 3 of these. They are removable using this little handy tightener, loosener. It's got a direction on it, tell you which way to go. You just pull them out, put the other one in, tighten it, and it's good to go. And again, this allows you to have something kind of closer to a 0 clearance, even though it's never going to be that. But if you're using this large ring with just a straight bit and it's a small piece, there's a chance you could push down into the ring. So you put the smaller diameter one on there and you've got more surface area to run across. In theory, you could use up to a 2 5/8 inch diameter bit, I guess, but that would be a very large router bit. All right, let's talk a little bit about this faceplate. This comes with the router table, this phenolic plastic one. This on its own is about $77. So not cheap. And I think this is one of the areas where, I don't want to say costs were cut, but it's a good plate, except over time there are some deficiencies. The first is that actually when you get it, this may not be flat. And if it's really bad, contact Kreg customer service and return it. You do not want to have to be dealing with a warped plate. However, over time, if you leave a router hooked up to this, it will sag. It will definitely sag a little bit. Now the table itself is not perfectly flat, but it's pretty good. It's pretty darn close. Good enough for anything you're going to be doing on this. However, this can sag, which can be a problem because when you're measuring your bit height out, if you're measuring it from down in the middle here, and that's sunken below, when you're running a piece of wood over here, it's going to be lower into the wood than you would expect because your height difference. Not a ton, but oftentimes when we're routing grooves, things like that, we're looking for an exact depth. And if this throws you off at all, it can be a problem. It can also be a problem when it's sagged, that when you're entering the cut, if you're pushing down here, the piece of wood will go like that. It's exaggerated, of course. Now this is the plate that comes with the router. And you'll notice I have 3 holes drilled in here. This one has 3 pre-drilled holes. If you buy this one, you have to do the drilling yourself and the countersinking yourself. A normal drill bit goes right through this. And we'll look at the back of this now as to how this works. The idea with this plate is that you take the fixed base to your router and affix it to the plate such that the bit is directly in the center. And Kreg helps you do this by having these little kind of grid coordinate patterns here. And you take the diameter and match it up with the diameter on these. That'll help you keep it centered so you're not off to the side. It's a very nifty pattern. You can see from where my holes are, I wasn't quite spot on, but I didn't really realize what this was for at the time, so that's what it's for. Mine was never perfectly in the center, which was not an issue at all, but just take your time when you're doing this drilling. It's worth it in the end to have the bit right in the center. You'll notice on this other plate, which was designed for, this is a Bosch specific plate. You can order plates from Kreg for certain routers that are pre-drilled. You'll notice these 3 holes right here. What that allows is for, on some fixed router bases, there is a raising and lowering mechanism with a way, you can't see it with this top on here right now, but a way to stick an Allen wrench or some kind of key through there to do it from above the table. This one comes with the options pre-drilled. This fits a couple different routers, not just the Bosch. So they have different areas here to put your wrench through. Obviously, if you want to do that, you're going to have to do it yourself on this one. When you are doing the drilling of holes in the alignment, take your time and think about where your power button is going to be. You want your power button to be in an easily reachable area. This would be the front. You'll be standing on the front. You want your power button somewhere here. So just really plan this out and think about how this is going to be angled so that you have access to your power button. And if you wish to drill another hole for the raising and lowering mechanism, make sure that's in front. It's easier to do that way. So just take your time. All right, we're now going to look at the leveling inserts. And this is held down by 4 Phillips head bolts, which hold it down to the inserts themselves. All right, so we'll take a look at the leveling mechanism here. And Kreg does sell these on your own if you wish to make your own router table. There's one in each corner, and it's got 2 threaded inserts, which are raised and lowered using the Allen key that Kreg provided. The bolts themselves end up going down into the leveling mechanism and pulling it down, which then will cause it to hit the top of each of these. Now this is really cool, and it works really well. It takes some playing with. If you move your router in and out, sometimes you have to do a little finicky messing with them after each time to try to make sure they're all right. And this is one area where this just happened to me the other day, where I'd call it a quality control issue or perhaps a design flaw issue. And the flaw, if you'll notice on this one, is that this little gold threaded insert, whatever you want to call it, that the bolt goes into, it started to raise. You can see how these are all flush. There is some kind of knurling on this, which I think is meant to just hold it as a pressure fit. Well, I only have one router, so I have to remove the router quite often, and because I have the insert plate, I have to remove the whole plate to take it out of there. This means a lot of screwing up and down of the faceplate. And I made the mistake, and I assume this is what happened, of using a powered driver to put it down. And usually I would stop before I got all the way, but I got careless. And it started, as the bolt started going down, pulling this up and out. Now I have to, once this finally comes out, I'm gonna glue it in there or something, maybe epoxy, whatever. But that's the first real kind of component issue I've had. Otherwise, I haven't had any major component issues other than the faceplate sinking, but I think that's something you just accept when it's not metal. Now the way these work is that we've got two in each corner, and the Allen key goes up into these, and you twist righty-tighty, lefty-loosey to raise and lower the mechanism. Now this takes a little while for initial setup, and what I suggest doing is lowering them so that the plate is fully below the table, and then slowly raising them until the plate is up. One thing you'll notice is that when you go to connect the plate down and to really screw it in, it will always go down farther than what it feels like when you've just got it sitting on there. So you're probably going to have to get to where you think is level, screw the plate in, and then unscrew the bolts just a little bit each so it's a little loose, and do a little more adjusting of these. It's really hard to get it in one go. You'd have to be very lucky to do it. Out of the box, I had to do some more leveling. I don't know if they're intended to come perfect or not, but I had to go through and do that on all of them. There's one in each corner. They're just bolted to the table. It's pretty easy to do. It's just a little time consuming and finicky. So let's talk about the table and the stand itself. The table has a interesting little dimpling on it, which I guess in theory is to reduce friction, especially sucking too of the wood. If you have a perfectly jointed and planed piece of wood and you set it down on a flat surface, it'll often stick. You almost have a hard time pulling it off. The dimpling provides a little air gap below, and it slides really well. Sometimes I paste wax it. I don't know if that's needed or anything like that, but when I'm doing my table saw and my bandsaw, I just come and do this as well. So far it hasn't ruined anything here. This does get marred up and scratched, so you're just gonna have to deal with the aesthetic look of that over time. As I said before, this is 16 by 24, so a pretty good work surface. And with the fence, you can run a 3-foot-ish board through and be able to control it. With feather boards, you can go longer. In front of the bit, you've got about 9.5 inches of area up here. With the fence removed and you're doing any kind of freehand edge profiling, you've got a lot of surface, but you've only got about 9.5 inches from where the direct center of the bit will be to the end here. So that's pretty good. I mean, how often are you working with pieces bigger than that you're not going to just be using the plunge router or the router fixed base itself? I've never had a problem where I've sat there and cursed myself for not getting a full-size table. The table itself is just shy of 16 inches tall. Now that presents an interesting conundrum. On one hand, it's portable, it stores pretty easily if you want to do that. However, if you stick it on top of a woodworking bench, you are suddenly up here pretty high and you're not able to get good downforce, which can be important to making sure a piece doesn't kick back. So what I had to end up doing is building a cart for it that's about 2 feet tall to put it at 30 whatever inches, which was a good height for me at about 6 foot. I would not be able to use this if it was sitting on a bench this high. I would not be able to use it comfortably, I guess I'll say that, and I would fear that I didn't have the appropriate pressure for true safety. So it's this kind of thing where, yes, it's a bench top, but if you set it on a decently sized normal woodworking bench, it brings it up pretty high. If you don't sit it on that, you're going to have to be on the floor unless you build something to stick it on. So just consider that you may either have to build something to stick it on or deal with it being relatively high. And this is the nature of every bench top anything, right? It's going to be on top of your bench and therefore either higher or lower, or if you're lucky, perfect height-wise. The stand itself is metal of some type. I'm not sure if it's steel or aluminum or what it is, but it's very rigid, very solid. It's excellent quality. These all come in separate pieces, and this is actually pretty hard to assemble on your own. You're going to need some clamps, some things to lean some stuff onto. I was lucky enough that I had a second hand who could help me put it together. But as you'll find out, some of these bolts are done in these very tight corners here. And trying to get your hands in there while holding on to some of these separate pieces can be a little bit of a pain. So just be wary that it's a little bit of a pain to set up, but once you've got it together, it's incredibly strong. The actual tabletop is, I want to say, some kind of maybe MDF. Something that's not super heavy, that's coated in this plastic. I don't think, actually I know for sure it's not solid plastic all the way through, because I remember when I inserted this miter bar, I'm pretty sure it's MDF. But it's relatively flat. This is not cast iron. You're not paying the cast iron price. I've never had a problem with how flat it is, but it is not perfectly flat, which can make it a little tricky when you're trying to level this plate, or rather actually for most tables, slightly lower on the right, slightly higher on the left, so that when you go in, you're not running into anything, and when you go out, you're making sure you get on top of the table. Overall, really good though. I think the table itself, the top, is great. It's a good amount of space, and it just works very well. Now, one downside to this, other than the height, is the weight, and this is an upside and a downside. It's light enough that you can definitely lift it by yourself. However, it's pretty easy to move if it's not secured down or placed in some kind of housing. My cart has a frame essentially around the bottom that keeps it from moving. But if you're trying to do any kind of pressing, and this is sitting on a bench, there's no obvious clamping point on this either. And one of the things that makes it hard to clamp is that this whole side is at an angle. So it's very difficult to get a clamp on there to clamp it to your bench. Kreg has provided quite a few pre-drilled holes in these. I'm assuming you could make some mechanism to help you clamp it on if you want to be able to put this bench away or not. So it's a great construction, and it's light enough to lift and move, but it's not heavy enough to stay in place by itself. So just consider that when you're setting it up. I have a whole little cart built for mine here, keep all my accessories underneath, and you can see I've got the frame around it that keeps the table still and not moving anywhere. There's one more downside to this, and this is more of a picky thing, but as I mentioned earlier, if you're doing a groove or a dado, all your dust is going down. There's no obvious mounting areas underneath to create some kind of contained box to then plug the vacuum into. I've been intending to build something for a long time. I just haven't got around to it. If I ever do, I'll make a video. But with some, nicer router tables, there's a way to mount some kind of enclosed box here that you can then put a vacuum into, and it'll suck all the dust away. So it's nice and open for access, and honestly a bunch of junk being put under there. But the dust collection there is no dust collection for anything that's going down. It will go right into your router. It will pile up on the area beneath it. And as I said, Kreg has a bunch of these pre-drilled holes in here for adding some kind of paneling or whatnot. But there's no obvious place other than, I guess, drilling into the table, which is either what I'll eventually do, or I'll build something that's freestanding. These holes are also used for mounting the power switch wherever you want it. So now that we've gone over the basic facts of the tables, what I like, what I don't like, I'm now going to do some test cuts. If you don't want to watch the test cuts, I'd give this thing an 8.5, 9 out of 10. I think the price is great. $250 for a solid, sturdy router table. If this doesn't last me my life, I'll be surprised. It will probably be me breaking it somehow that is an accident on my own. I think it's a buy once, cry once router table. You can go much cheaper, but if you buy this, you're going to be pretty happy you bought this. And the only thing I ever had to upgrade was the router lift that goes in here. and that was less so due to sagging, but more so due to a problem with the Bosch fixed base that caused the height not to stay in place. I'm not sure I would have bought the router lift anytime soon were it not for that. So don't be too concerned, and like I said, if this is not relatively flat, contact Kreg. They may send you a replacement. So at $250, like I said, great purchase, absolute buy for me, and I would buy it again if I needed one for any other reason. Now, depending upon your router's fixed base, if you've not got the lift, you can probably change the bit from the top depending upon how far your router will lift up. Now, it's very tight. Rockler, I believe, or I'm sure other stores sell offset wrenches that have a built-in angle. You will end up scraping your insert on occasion if you like to change the bit from above. So I just wanted to note that you can change the bit from above, I believe, with the default one, or I know with the default one, as long as your router itself, the fixed base, is tall enough. We're gonna go ahead and do a groove through a piece of pine now. So I'm gonna throw on the smallest of the throat inserts because this is a 1/2-inch bit, so it will fit through this just fine. And they come with the tool, but I honestly just do them by hand at this point. I've never had one come out. We're gonna then loosen these up a little bit, even though this cut isn't going to be sitting inside of here. I actually like that suction from the vacuum, which I mentioned earlier, to be able to get a little bit of the dust, though most of it's going to go down. But I like that added suction to hold against the fence. Obviously, the tighter you close these, the more suction there will be. If you have them wide open, there's obviously a larger entrance, and you will get less suction. You want to always make sure you do this before you ever start routing it. The last thing you want is for the bit to just spin right into the face plates. With your fence properly tightened, it shouldn't be able to move at all. Again, you can see why I have this sitting in a platform, because it can, well, you can't do it right now, but this can easily be pushed back and forth if it's on some kind of bench top. We're also going to use a pretty big long piece of wood for this so you can get an idea. I'm not going to use feather boards for this one, though I will afterwards show you how those work and run it through. Actually, you know what? We'll use a feather board in this top one right now for this, because this allows my hands to be on the outside. Now, with the feather boards that Kreg sells, or with any of them, you're obviously going to have the miter bar on here. So you've got to remove that and then just have the T-bolt exposed sticking through the other side. So now that we've got that out of there, we're just going to put our T-bolts back through. And one thing to make sure you notice is that this needs to be this way. Not like this. It has to be this way so that you can push through. So you have to flip it around from the direction it was in. All right, this part's a bit awkward, but you're gonna leave these a little loose and come over and just line them up and slide it in. We'll set the height once we've got them both in there. It takes a little bit of working around to get it there. Now, some people put one before, one after. Some people put it over. The table itself comes with a little shield meant to block debris coming up, but I just find that it gets in the way all the time, so I've taken mine off. I have no idea where it is, which is why I didn't include it in the initial assessment, because I didn't have it to show you. So I'm just going to put one right before, and we're just going to set the height by putting our workpiece under there. Now when we get right to the end, we're going to get them pretty close, and we're going to then push down to get some positive pressure on the workpiece, because we obviously want it to hold. That'll allow us to go through, but not easily come back. It takes a lot of force. Now I'm going to be putting through a piece that is 25 inches long, so you get a pretty good idea of, you know, a size board that can go through this. And if you have feather boards here and a feather board here, which I'll show in a minute, you could do quite a long piece of wood, especially if you had some kind of roller or other table. You just have to be able to get over here to continue pushing it through. But you can do a lot size-wise pieces of wood if you have some way to support it off to the infeed side. One thing I'll note if you're new to routers and router tables is you don't want to really take more than maybe 1/8 of an inch cut at a time max, unless you have some reason very specifically that you need to go a deeper depth all at once. It just puts a lot of strain on the motor. You can get more kickback. So really only try to go 1/8 of an inch max at a time. All right, so you can see the dust collection issue here is that you need the fence relatively close so you're not wobbling back and forth, but on grooves, the dust goes out and down. There's quite a bit below, we've got the whole groove through there. Now imagine you needed to go a ½ inch deep. You're gonna get a lot of dust. I know Rockler sells some kind of vacuum attachment that sits off to the side. I don't know how well that's going to work unless the dust is somehow shooting out. You just kind of deal with it, and ideally you clean this out between cuts if possible. You can see, let me unplug the router real quick here. You can see that some stringy pieces of wood have gotten caught in here. These are beveled slightly at the bottom to allow dust to not kind of push you out of place, but if you have a ton of it, it can start to build up there, and with the vacuum on, it will pull it towards there and can get stuck. Minor inconvenience, not a real problem in terms of harming the functionality of it, but just something to know. All right, the next demonstration we're going to do is with a slot cutting bit. So we're going to open up the fence face plates much wider here, and we'll narrow in as we go in. Now the nice thing about the fence too is that with this kind of bit, your bearing, which is your final depth, if you wish to go that deep, is really far away. That would be a ton of material to try to take off at once. So with the fence, of course, you can expose only as much as you want. Again, I would suggest not going a whole lot more than 1/8 of an inch at a time. I'm just kind of eyeballing this for now. We'll lock the fence in, we'll lock the faceplates in, and with your router off and unplugged, I always like to reach under there and see we're hitting the fence there. So we're going to move this one back out a little bit to the left. Again, the router is unplugged. All right, we're good to go there. I really like to have these as close as possible without risking anything, because it's closer to having a single solid fence across there, and there's less of a chance that you're going to dip in. Going to hook the vacuum up again, and this is one where the vacuum will really work pretty well because it will be directly sucking in the dust because the exposed side will be on the other side. We're going to do an edge and a face on this one, so we'll do the edge first. I'm just going to do this one by hand without any feather boards, and then we'll do the feather boards on this side for the face. All right, we've got our slot cut in there, and as you can see, very little dust once the vacuum is able to suck the dust back. So when you're using it in that way, in which the dust is going to be expelled back, it's really pretty good. I'd say you get 75–80% of it, depending upon how big of a throat insert you need to have in there. The bigger it is, the more you will get falling down. But it's very effective when you are cutting something where the bit is open to the back. We'll now do a face cut. I'm going to set up a feather board for this one. On this one, we're going to go in the miter slot. Kreg sells these as a pack of 2, and with the T-bolt that comes with it, you can just barely get 2 of them stacked. But if you have a longer T-bolt that's the same size as the bottom of this, which I'm not sure what size that is, you can have an easier time stacking them. But they do both stack just barely with the included T-bolt. For our second feather board, we have 2 things. One, obviously these can't get too tight up against each other as the miter slots or miter bars hit each other. So perhaps if you want them as close as possible, move this one a little more that way, this one a little in. And if you just use this in here, remember you have to flip it back over. You have to put the bolts through the other side. Now because our router bit is sticking out, we have to bring the workpiece over to the other side, put some pressure on it, and lock it down. Our slot is all the way through there. Again, little to no dust on top here. There's a little bit behind, and there's definitely some below. So if you're sitting this on something, you're going to have to vacuum or dust off whatever is below. But that worked very well. This fence is just a little over 3 1/4, so you actually get some pretty good reference surface. I imagine that's pretty close to most table saw fences. So, it's pretty close to 90 degrees, close enough that as long as this is correctly jointed and squared and you hold it up against there, you're going to stay at 90 degrees. And we're going to then go ahead and do our last test, which is going to be an edge profile in here, and I'm going to show you a tip for how to do end grain. To start with is some freehand edge profiling. Now when you get your table, you will notice you get this pin. I have my router lift in here now, just because my fixed base doesn't work. So just ignore this. You're going to have the other insert plate. And the pin on yours and this one just goes into here, right on the table. And what it's used for is when we're entering a cut on the router, we're coming right to left because the bit is always spinning this ways. And you want to be cutting into the spin. Now, if you're really experienced, you may not need to use this pin, but if this is your first router table, this is to give you an extra pressure point to enter. And it can be really handy, especially at first, if you're not used to how to put the pressure on there. Now, something I've noticed over my time, and I haven't used this thing in a long time, is that you want to almost come in and touch it as you're going in. You don't want to try to ram through here. You want to just come in and touch it with a slight bit of forward movement. And that will allow it to engage and then you to proceed to make your cut. You will be able to go all the way around without ever leaving the bit. Or, since a router has a cutting point directly in the center, essentially, you can cut from anywhere on this as long as you are going with the cutting blade. So as long as you're going clockwise as it spins counterclockwise, you're always going to be fine. There are times when I have very large pieces that I'm edge profiling on, and I will end up around here doing something, and as long as you're always moving clockwise, you're good to go. Now, as we mentioned before, there's no dust collection without the fence. So something I've found to do over time is take my shop vac with this kind of reducer thing on it and just clamp it to the table if I'm not going to need the back. Now here, I'm not quite sure, so I'm going to move it back a little further. And this will help some. Obviously, it depends on the power of your shop vac, but this will allow when the dust flies off for you to get some of the dust off of there. Now, I know a lot of people when they're freehand routing or just routing in general, they use their hands through there, just their free hands. I've never been a huge fan of that. I have some push blocks, and they're all canted at an angle so that I'm putting pressure in, mainly for when the fence is there, so that I have some pressure going inwards. But I always use them for the freehand routing as well. I just find, A, my fingers are much further away, and it feels a little more secure. So if you are interested, all you have to do is take a 2x4, a piece of plywood, and some sandpaper, cut an angle on one edge of the 2x4, glue it down to there. There may be a screw through there. I'm not sure if I did or not. And obviously some kind of bandsaw or jigsaw to cut that out, and then a little sander to round that over. If you do not have this power switch, you will have to reach under the table to turn the router on and off. So you'll see me using the power switch, but this does not come with the table as far as I know. For $30, I think it's great. I think it's really worth it, so I'd consider that, or considering a cheaper aftermarket one perhaps if you can mount it to the table. Now, as you can see from that little clip there, the pin actually can get in the way if you have a very funky shape. You can see the round over there. But it's really useful if you're using a straight piece of wood, especially or something with a very light curve. But when you get into really funky angles and kind of extreme angles, it can tend to hit on the pin. So I'm going to go ahead and take this out now as I finish doing this. Another thing I want to point out when you have an odd angle and you're coming in, always come in on the flattest point you can. It's really hard to come in at an angle. If you have to, you can do it if your piece just doesn't have any flat sides. But I always suggest coming in somewhere where there's a more gentle angle or a flat side. Now, as you can see, we've still got some dust left here, but it's not bad. It's not in the way. That's all rounded over now. So we're going to go ahead to the next test cut. Now, one con of this, though it's a con of every router table and something that just happens naturally, is that if you have your light source coming from this side, when the fence is off of there, you've got tons of light. But the minute the fence is on, you can even see here a shadow is cast. Now, depending upon how much light you have elsewhere, that's either not an issue or it can be a big problem. I personally wear a headlamp all times in the shop to give me amazing light. Magnetic lights will stick to the legs and front of this table. So if you want to get a little magnetic arm lamp and clamp it there to see over to get truly great light, that's an option. Other than that, there's just nothing you can do, but it's a bit of a con if you don't already have a ton of light in your shop to provide from other angles. So if you're deciding where to put your router table, you may want to put it slightly under a light, but not directly, because if you're over this and your light is directly over, you will also cast a shadow, which can darken this. So the light somewhere kind of near where the fence is and above, where your body's not going to be, but not behind the fence, I think is ideal. I've got a shop light just kind of up and slightly to the left, and since I'm pushing to the left, I can see it all as I enter. When we get to doing things like edge profiles, your edge profile size is more determined by the height, and so you'll naturally, unless you have some very specific reason not to, want to align the bearing with the fence itself. It's easier to push a little forward than back into it. Tighten one of them, then go back and do the second. And you don't want it directly rubbing, but you don't want to be able to tip your ruler in there very much. So you want it real close, but not fully on there, or else you may hit the bearing and come out and go like that and have an odd edge profile. Now you can see here, as I mentioned before, that because the cutting center of a router bit is directly in the center, this fence doesn't have to be square. On nicer router tables, they usually have almost a table saw style rail. This is just a bench top, but this doesn't need to be at a right angle to this to use the fence. So I just have no concern about where this is. As long as it's not awkward for me to go and reach, I generally just put it to where my measurement is and lock it in wherever it happens to be. So if you're going to be using the fence for edge profiling and you're going all the way around a square piece of wood, or rather in this case, a rectangular piece, you'll know from the table saw that you never want to run something up against the fence that is longer than it is wider, because you can have this danger for kickback. Well, on a router table, you can get a miter gauge and do it that way. It's very hard without some kind of fence alignment to line this up perfectly square with this. It's a mess. It's not really needed. What you want to do is take some kind of other piece of wood that you know is square, and you're going to put it behind it. You're going to hold it as you go through to keep this from being able to tip at all. It will be pushed up against these two. This is also a good tip if you're worried about tear out, because this will add essentially a backer board to it. You can see I've used this numerous times on different corners as a backer board. So you'll go through and we'll just push it through like that. Oftentimes if I'm edge profiling using the fence on a square piece of wood, I like to do the end grain first in case there is any little bit of tear out. It will then be cleaned up by the long grain cut. All right, you can see that worked out pretty well. I'm just starting small here. When you're going with end grain first, do not take a huge chunk off. That can really worsen the ability for kickback, so take a little bit at the time. And as you go around, of course, do every side. Then the time you raise it, start with the end grain, go around, do every side. So we'll raise it a little bit more here, and we'll do the end grain again. We got a little bit of burning there, so I'm either going too fast or too slow. I got to play with that. But you can see that's a great end grain edge profile. There is no tear out on either side, so the backer board really helps. And more than anything, it's for safety. So if you don't want to use a miter gauge and somehow do it like that, and if you don't want to freehand it, which again I think is simpler on something like this, just make sure you have a backer board. Okay, so that's going to finish up the review of the Kreg Benchtop Router Table. I did not show you the jointing. I have a full video on how to use this as a jointer, so check that out if you're interested in that feature. If you have any questions, comments, or something to add that I left out, whether it's a pro or a con, please leave it in the comments below. Have a good one, everybody.